Welcome to EVONA Origin Stories, the space podcast where we look to bring you extraordinary leaders from within the sector and their fascinating stories of early life, career, and how they broke into the space industry. This is episode 2. Today's guest is one of our industry's best characters. He's worked with Oprah Winfrey and worked on dozens of feature films.
He's a man that works exclusively in roles where there's a real purpose. He puts his phenomenal communication skills to use, helping his employers transform their PR and communications.
He's worked his way up from humble beginnings to lead PR and communications for companies such as Shazam, Audible, and Spire.
He's a character with unmatched charisma. Ladies and gentlemen, today's guest is James Pearson. How's it going, James?
No complaints. Really excited about this. You guys are always seeming to call interesting talent and great people in the sector. So I'm like, why am I on this call?
Me too, to be honest.
Just kidding.
You know, it's amazing to hear people's stories. There's so many people that want to enter the space industry, but there's just such a perceived wall up in terms of people thinking that they wouldn't be able to. So, you know, what this series is about is just speaking to interesting people, understanding what their story is, and hoping that people that listen might be able to see themselves in the mirror and then potentially find a route into the sector. So, yeah, over to the questions, I guess.
Great.
Yes. So tell us your story. Where did it all begin for you? And how do you feel that the space sector has changed since then?
Well, I got my start in PR and crisis and communications probably about 20 years ago. And there's one thing to me that I see is a common parallel between business today and business yesterday, is that there are a lot of systems and infrastructures that existed in how people got jobs. Do you understand? People very traditional ways. People would, learn a trade, go to college, graduate, and get their first job. You'd be an assistant, manager, director, VP, and on the way you went up the corporate ladder. Not unlike how, many people, always went to college, graduated, white picket fence, had children and a family. I think it was Steve Jobs who said the person who developed those infrastructures is long since dead, and they didn't have any of the information that we do. So the idea of your life path, your work path, your career, all these things are constantly evolving. I just don't think humans really see it in a linear fashion. The entire idea of your work path is that you spend your entire life culling experience, and you become practiced in whatever that skill or profession it is, and eventually at the end of the career you have more experience in it. With the space sector, because it's such a new sector, the idea of people having a long trail of experience, or companies that have had a reputation sort of equity, that doesn't really exist because it's so new. So there's this constant push between the old space sector and the new space sector. To me, I just look at it all as it's a creative destruction of technology. If you go back and look at when Google first came about or eBay first came about, there was always pushback. There were always 20 different there were 20 different types of services like this, but there was one that the people chose and it became ubiquitous. With the space industry, there's so many different technologies. There's data, there's build, there's launch. There's so many different companies that you're really in that sweet spot at the starting of a sector where it really is the golden age of space. If you saw how the Industrial Revolution changed from people moving from the western part of the United States in search of gold to the eastern part of the United States where more urban centers were built, it was really about that different people were allowed access to the American dream. So what I love about space is that you can have this entrepreneurial wild card element where you have people like Swarm or Sarah Sprangello, and it's something that's completely outside the frame of traditional space. And then you'll have companies like SpaceX, Rocket Lab, and Spire and Planet, where they are almost building a whole new infrastructure within the space industry. So for me, how that applies to my own, path in 25 years of PR and crisis comms and communications for technology companies, is that I always wanted to tell a story of technology that really was emerging. It really was, a collaborative creative destruction in the sector. That means the technology was being accepted at the same time that the general population was agreeing to make it ubiquitous. Now, all this sounds kind of long-winded, but it really basically is the same thing of why there's a Apple iPod in your hand and not a Microsoft Zune. Both of them had the exact same amount of marketing and budgets, but people decided that the experience of an Apple iPod was way better. So flashback to about when I was probably 9 or 10 years old. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm a Midwest person, and I've always had an interest in space. The fact that we were lucky to have a NASA research facility in Cleveland, Ohio, and it was like a stone's throw away from my house. So I've always had that core interest in space, and at the same time, I've always had an interest in when new sectors sort of, I wouldn't have known this when I was young, if you ask me, but I as a 54-year-old guy, I understand that I really love joining sectors or industries or technology that they had amazing potential, but just people, they weren't ubiquitous yet. When something's undiscovered country, to me, it's like one of my favorite things in the world. And I think I was probably like 9 or 10 years old. I read a book called The Electronic Olympics by a guy named Hal Higdon, who's gone on to be considered, he's a kid's book writer, fiction writer, but he's gone on to be one of the first people who wrote about an actual infrastructure of technology and something that was a sort of a pillar of culture. And it was about the entire Olympics being electronic and what would happen if the races were digital. And I read this book as a kid, and it was so many things that are practical and everyday thing, but it was in 1976. I mean, I'm an old person. I was like, this amazing technology will change the world. And one of the things that I think about new space that really rocks people, even like over this weekend, literally today, there are 4 people from SpaceX in low Earth orbit, going around the Earth. We're casual about it. You know what I mean? Like there's times like when space travel happened in its early days, it was something that froze the entire country's attention. And I really believe that, what you're seeing now is it's becoming commonplace. Like what you're seeing billionaires do, I believe you'll see the common person do in 5 to 10 years. So 100%. What's exciting about that is you're seeing traditional people that have done well in traditional business now move to follow the dream of like, I want to, ad astra, I want to see the rest of follow my dreams to space. All that sort of, let's see, I don't know how to say this gracefully. All of that achievement being funded by people's just straight desire or success in other sectors is making the general population look at space different. But from the career path side of it, I think, there were times, I think in the first shuttle teams, a lot of the engineers were people that they called from the Eastern Seaboard that just happened to be welders or engineers that never worked in the space sector. And they're like, we're building these teams of people. My friend's father, I think, was a welder. He got called down to work on the first shuttle and worked on every shuttle. And so it's totally uncharacteristic. It's something that you hear in folklore. And I think it would be, if you go back in time, it was very difficult to be considered someone that would be an employee in old space, someone that was going to be a satellite engineer. You had a career path that was probably with the same company for 8 years, and there were 6 to 5 industry experts that moved around from one company to the next. As technology changes, experience changes. And I think there are so many people now that understand the potential of space is only limited by how diverse the thought is the person puts in what their business model is. And again, when you have a new sector forming, people, one side of the world believes that it will be commercial air travel. One side believes it will be monitoring the Earth. One part believes it will be the construction of reusable rockets. Like there are things like the idea of just sending a rocket into space and it crash lands in the ocean and it's never to be seen again. It has, in the last 5 years, it's become archaic. Like there are companies like SpaceX, Rocket Lab. What these companies are doing is not only commoditizing space. You're showing there are true revenue streams. There's true data. There's also information that you can only get by using data from space. So the learning curve of companies building teams that are specifically going to have amazing new space or aerospace ventures, you're seeing people seek out a type of person. And going back to the original question, how does someone get started in space? I started in a traditional industry like crisis comms and PR. And luckily enough that it was for technology, to apply that to everything that I've done, or every other sector, that's a Rubik's Cube of communication. And I think when you talk about traditional business or traditional entertainment, there are just cycles of how things work. When the motion picture industry started, the most powerful person was the studio, not the actor. And you can go back to in the early days of film, Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin formed a company called United Artists. And what they did is like, we're going to make our own films outside the Paramount structure. It doesn't have to be shown in the Paramount theater. It's just going to be a great Charlie Chaplin movie. And originally, the film studios were like, we'll block you. We just won't show your films in the theater. You'll have nowhere to show them. So United Artists made a deal with Paramount, and it was a Charlie Chaplin movie. It was the talent that was mitigating the consumer's activity. And space is the same way. At one point, people wanted data from space, and Iridium and many other companies spent years putting satellite structures and infrastructures up. Now that you can reduce the time of construction on a satellite from 5 years down to 5 weeks, all of these things are, the people are going to reflect that as well. So, when I was approached by Spire to join the company and to get into the sector, I had a huge learning curve that I had no awareness of the space sector. But one of the things that they had the challenge of, Spire was an amazing company with already substantial press when I joined, but they had a problem that the world had a hard time delineating between new space and old space. It's really just, in most boardrooms and, most conference room, space is space. And that, I think Elon Musk, Blue Origin, even Planet Spire, the attention, it changed how people saw the sector. So once people see that there's more diversity in thought, diversity in companies, diversity in the product, I actually think that immediately turns to a diversity in people, because you can't build a great company without great people. It's just the oldest cliche in the world, but I live by it. It's kind of like, you can't make a great sandwich without great cheese. I don't mean to be, smart about it, but you really are no greater than the sum of your parts. And I think in the space industry, because going back to it being so embryonic and new, it's something that we've always championed from our individual countries. I remember when I was at Spire, we were so proud of the fact that, the high percentage of satellites that were produced outside of Glasgow, and we were pivotably, feeding into that number. That kind of thing, now that's history. Like, Glasgow is satellites. Like, there's a lot of things that have happened in the sector where they've been defined. So, you only get one time to define your career path. If your career is your life and work combined, both those, we are all trying to have a great life, a solid work, and an amazing career, but your career is your life and your work combined. So they both have to have this tiered mission. And you asked me originally, like, how did I get my start? Like, I came from the film industry, and luckily, my mom was the kind of person that really encouraged me to do anything and everything that I could possibly do. And it was a completely different socioeconomic structure. America was really different. When I graduated from college in 1989, I knew there was going to be a sound problem there. I graduated from college in 1989. And so not only pre-internet, a lot of things that are commonplace now weren't structures that were in place. And I knew I had a burning desire to tell stories. And at the time, for me, I was sure it was going to be through motion pictures and film. I love films. My whole family loved films. And I really wanted to go to film school. I was a little too out of my range. I was such a, just a Midwestern person. There was no way that I was going to go to California or New York. It was just both those cities to me seemed like you would end in a fiery death, which is kind of funny that I now live in New York. But when I was a little kid, I was like, go to New York, someone will hit you over the head with a bottle and it'd be the end of your days. For some reason, I was completely terrified of New York. I think they're talking about moving. The first presence in Europe for Spire was Glasgow. And when they opened the office, I think Peter said, don't people roam the street with knives at Glasgow? And I was like, I felt the same way about New York. You have these preconceived notions. But
so apparently, I've actually spent a little bit of time there myself, and it's the only place in the world where you get stabbed, but then they'll phone for help afterwards. That's what they say there, because ultimately the people there are so nice.
I tell you, I had exact same experience where I saw a couple walk through a fight and people did the London Bridge. Like, the guy stopped fighting for the couple to go through. They're on a date night, so we'll let them pass. It's very, very, very interesting place. But also, it's like, That's that kind of spirit of like, it's a, you know, it's a town where it's a, you know, they built ships there, so it makes sense that it have evolved to a place where now they build satellites. All those things are common in when a sector is being born. Like the company is in an urban market, you know, it's a startup. There are all these elements about startups that they have characteristics I've seen over and over again. And I'll say when I was approached by Spire, I saw the same creative destruction I've seen in every other sector. I saw the same passion and amazing technology, but there was one thing that was completely different about the new space sector. I was like, this is the potential to be way bigger than a Google or one individual company. You're talking about $1 billion prospect on 20 different 100x. Like, you know, I'm a Tess Hatch addict. I don't know if you know Tess, but she's a partner of Bessemer Ventures. And whenever Tess speaks about space, she really talks about, you know, there's so many things having their exponential, you know, commoditization or success rate, you know, that you have Blue Origin and SpaceX both having these amazing milestones. It seems like there's so many space milestones that I kind of gotten a little used to it. I'm like, oh, there's gonna be another one.
We're the same.
It's like
it's just every single week. It's like, right, this record's been broken, or this company's been invested in by this much, and it's just non-stop, which is obviously amazing to see. But it's, you know, it's not just on the upstream side. You know, I think people, when they think about space, they can understand what's happened with SpaceX now with the astronauts, and that's what most people talk about. But actually, that's about like 5%, if that, of the overall sector. And the other 95% of it is also going through crazy like new milestones. So yeah, it's an incredible place to be, isn't it? It's just there's nothing else really like it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it's like when I can compare it to other sectors and go back and say, well, you know, when I was at Audible, you know, people really had a very, very hard time understanding what a digital audiobook was. So there was a learning curve with these things. And I've always had, when I was at Groove Shark, you know, we really had to, you know, the idea of streaming audio as opposed to a la carte purchase of one digital song. People were like, no, I want my iTunes. You know, it's like, you can't change consumer behavior. Companies don't change consumer behavior or consumer ubiquity. They act on it and are defined by it. And so, like, when I got my start, I came from the film industry. You know, I was very fortunate. I went to a school called Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, and it's probably the premier film program on the East Coast. But my mentors, two professors, Jim Klein and Julia Reichert. Julia Reichert's gone on to, you know, produce some pretty amazing films. Her last film, American Factory, won an Academy Award. It was produced by Netflix, and Higher Ground with the Obama family. So again, Julie has been someone who's been in my life. She's my first professor, and you know, over the last 10 years, like she just directed David Chappelle's new documentary about his Corona experience, and you know, actually it was Steve Bognar, her partner, who directed the film. I want to make sure I get that right. But the school that I went to, Wright State, really had this edict that they looked beyond the fact that we were in Ohio. And so the experiences that we got, you know, film wise, I mean, really, we got to work with John Sayles on 8 Men Out. I was on a Michael Jackson tour for probably about 4 or 5 shows where we filmed, you know, just archival film the shows for Michael Jackson because, you know, Wright State loaned him film gear. We just really were allowed to see a lot of stuff outside of Ohio that showed me that media and business were really big. And when I graduated from college, I was solely in the film industry, and I got an internship offer from IATSE, the International Alliance of Theater Stage Employees, and I got 3 cities to choose from. It was Florida to work on Nickelodeon with kids getting slimed, Chicago to work on actual films, or Detroit to work on car commercials. And I was an assistant cameraman, and I so far from digital. I had a love for tech, but again, you know, this is a time frame where the personal computer was just becoming ubiquitous. So it's just technology was completely different at the time. Yeah. And I always, you know, I ended up doing PR for independent films because I was taught by independent filmmakers. And then I moved to New York. At the time, I was literally paying my rent doing PR for people. And I got a couple jobs working as assistant on films. I moved to California with the movie Mo Money, and I met Damon Wayans. And I saw the film industry as it was, and I was like, it's interesting, but quite frankly, I love business more. And I really didn't, this was strange. I had a liberal arts degree. It was kind of obtuse. I didn't have this amazing business experience. My mom had always loved business, and I think I vicariously felt that from her. And when I was in California, I was in the LA riots. And that was something, it was a pivotal change in my life. Just like I was really young. I've never seen social unrest at that kind of level. And, you hear about people having marches for, people's rights and stuff like that in the 60s, but I really just never experienced anything like that. I'm a little kid from Ohio, and I was just smack dab in the LA riots. And it made me definitely feel like I will never live in the West Coast. I'm an East Coast person. It's just different. West Coast and East Coast have always been really different. But at the time, there was a lot of things that I'd never seen before. And the amount of unrest, it really made me miss being towards the East Coast. So probably around 2001, I moved to, around 1998 or 2000, I moved from LA to New York. And again, I was intent on working in film, but the internet had started to really have this, it was a buzz. Like everyone was talking, the way everyone's talking about Bitcoin and crypto today. People were talking about like, wow, there's, web pages and people are designing things and there's blogs. And, a lot of people know that the word blog comes from weblog. Like it used to be like, there's a weblog you go look at, and blog means weblog. But I say that to people, I'm like, no, it doesn't. It's impossible. And it's that we were really building the pillars for a lot of the things in the internet that exist today. And when I moved to New York, I had no clue what I was going to do. And I met Jeff Dotchis and Craig Kanarik, who right now, back then they were just two guys on the Lower East Side, but Craig is the person responsible for the measurements of the banner ad. And Jeff is probably one of the smartest, CEOs or pioneers in digital media I've ever met in my life. And they had the idea to form a company that was just to design websites and to create digital interfaces for company. Now, that was considered radical at the time. Like our catchphrase was digital change management. And the idea of like, I remember we did 60 Minutes on CBS, and this was a time when like most tech companies were being challenged. And it was Bob Simon, God rest his soul, he's a genius, amazing interviewer for CBS. And he said, I just don't get what you do. What do you do? And I remember having a panic attack like behind my CEO. I was like, just say everything that can be digital will be digital. We had like 100 of these phrases. And Jeff was genius. He was like, we do digital change management. And I was like, fantastic, nail on the head. But Bob Simon was like, okay, well, what if I'm a trucking company? What if I'm, and it was funny to see like people back then, they didn't understand. There's an article on my wall somewhere in this apartment that says, Amazon CEO says one day e-commerce will be viable. It's a Wall Street Journal article. And it's like, Jeff Bezos says that one day people will buy things online. And I'm like, yeah. Now the article's yellow, but it's not 30 years old. I read that article in the Wall Street Journal, like, hey, that Amazon thing might work out. And now it's, a pillar of infrastructure.
Everything.
So it's kind of like when you hear someone sit down that's an investor and they're like, oh, I made XX millions and I did great, but I just missed out on Google. It's like, I missed out on Google. I hear that all the time when someone will say like, oh, I should have known about Facebook or whatever it was. And the exciting thing about that time in the internet is it wasn't about money. It wasn't about shares. It wasn't about M&A or mergers and acquisition. It was about, we would see things and just be like, this is amazing. And, I can trace it back to a moment. What happened is all of these companies that were designing websites and digital interfaces became something that the market saw. And people were like, when are they going to go public? And the first company was a company called Globe.com. And they were basically a digital design house and two, smart guys. And, I'm probably more biased towards Razorfish because Razorfish and agency are probably still, Razorfish is probably one of the largest digital service companies in the world, and it still exists. So I always thought that was great that we started by like two people, many acquisitions. But the core model of those companies was really just, building digital interfaces for companies. And, a lot of that in the early days of web design, to me, was FOMO. Companies didn't know, they knew you needed a website, but they didn't know why. And if you didn't have one, you were hard pressed to get one. And if you do, we designed websites for, some of the most bold-faced names in the world, everybody would want to get a website designed by us. All those things became part of the self-fulfilling prophecy that I was like seeing companies that, grow exponentially. The fact that people are like, oh, we need a website. And it was interesting to watch the companies that would get a website, build it, and it would actually become a part of their successive business model, or the companies where it just was a placard for the company, a digital advertisement. So that was something to watch firsthand, like to watch at Razorfish, really watch companies build a website. And, perfect examples like G-Shock by Casio for their watch. They built that website. It became insanely trafficked. It won a Clio, and people, because it was really interactive and had games and things that people never saw online. So I had this experience of like, wow, I was like, wow, there was a box in most people's house, not in most people's house, but people who were affluent had a computer, and it did, 2 or 3 things. When you start to see, HTML or web design come into the picture, it's really when you're moving from things being bulletin boards and, the matrix or, digital signals to something where you could go to eBay. Someone could go trade a Pez dispenser. eBay was founded, I don't know if you do or not, and I know that out of people trading Pez dispensers, it's a candy dispenser toy. Yeah, that's how. Yeah, and maybe it's not Pez. It's some kind of toy like that. I should maybe when we cut this part out. But I will say, eBay. I can rephrase that. eBay and a lot of the companies that got to wild ubiquity, like back in the days of MySpace or early days of Facebook, they really they started around people's voracious appetites or interests. The way you see like their individual marketplaces on Facebook, like Facebook Friends, Facebook Tattoo Artists, that really is born from the start of the internet, because there wasn't enough traffic for it to be delineated like that. So brands did it. Do you understand? It's like Craigslist and Angie's List. Those things really were formed and became, those are the first ways people really used the internet, because I was like, wow, I want a cheap ticket to California. Go see if someone's selling a round trip in on Craigslist. Like, I need to rent an apartment in New York. I remember there was a time where 90% of the people rented a house from Craigslist. Now, wow. That sounds archaic right now. Even just saying MySpace sounds like you should immediately stop listening to this podcast because someone said MySpace. To understand the history of the internet, you really have to look, or the history of how like creative destructions come in these verticals. This has happened over and over and over again. I mean, when I really look at my career path, I got my start. My first job was with Oprah Winfrey and working in film and production. Second job was with John Hughes, God rest his soul. But again, John was a person who looked at tech. I worked on I worked on the sequel to Home Alone. I think I was working on post to that, and probably like 10 movies with John. And John, John created the Home Alone franchise, and a lot of those early 80s movies that really, they were cultural phenomenons. So to learn just storytelling from someone like that, I apply every aspect of how John told stories to how I pitch technology or how I pitch space. And it's because those were early things. If I go through the through line of my jobs, I mean, the CEOs that took chances on me, from Don Katz at Audible to Sam Tarantino and Josh Greenberg, God rest his soul, at Grushark. These were companies, like, again, streaming was on the rise. Everyone wanted a single digital track. Shazam hired me when they were in the point that they decided they wanted to be acquired. And, it was a time when just a lot of things were shifting in how people listen to music and how people use devices. And, even if you're talking about things with people accepting new technology, or consumers deciding there will be a new technology, that's sort of the commonality I see in my career path in the space industry. There was a time when people were like, we must go to the moon. We have to, we have to see, as the stars are part of our existence. But the limitations of technology defined how that dream would become reality. Now, I think when you see the enthusiasm of how everyone gets excited about, there is a lot more to what is in the stars and the data and the information we can use and utilize behind it. I actually think this is the time where, the Wright brothers tried to launch a plane many, many times, but after Kitty Hawk and it really got an elevation, it changed how everyone viewed the industry, the people. It wasn't just two crackpots. And when aerospace or commercial flight began, it really was limited to people that were insanely brave, or insanely wealthy. And you look at how things evolve, and I actually feel like looking at a CubeSat versus a traditional terrestrial satellite, looking at Planet Labs observation, how they use cameras based to how they did it 50 years ago, or CCTV, it's leaps and bounds of the evolution. There's the amount of time between technology evolution becoming theoretical and practical is at its highest time in American history. I'm sorry, in human history. People will tell me about a device or something that exists, and within 3 days, someone is sending me a video of someone has built a demo. I don't go to a consumer electronics show anymore in Las Vegas. It's a popular show in North America. The last CES I went to, a guy came into a room and said, "This is coming out next year," and pulled out his iPhone and shot The Incredibles, the Disney movie. He shot it into the sky at movie size. Like, it was the size of a movie theater. I've never seen anything like it. It was perfect quality. We're all stunned. I was like, how is he doing this? Out of his phone, a projection quality version of The Incredibles is in the sky. And then he ran out of the party. And I was like, who's that guy? What was that tech? Everyone was like, what was that? I never saw it again. I never saw the guy again. I never saw it. So there's a part of tech where it's like there's mystery to it. And I think in the last 10 years, that's gone away. Like, really, it's been about like what Apple does, what IBM does, what it's become, verticals. And I think new space changed that. It's it's a wild card. It's different. There's small companies like, when Swarm came about, I was like, this is the greatest small company in the world. When SpaceX acquired them, I was like, this is going to be the wildest 10 years of business in the world, because you don't know which one of these companies is going to be the company that has some amazing, like, I look at companies like ICEYE. Every time ICEYE sends out an image, I'm just like, that's amazing. Like, I've never seen anything like that anywhere. And it's like, that's creative destruction.
It's really interesting to talk about the sector. I mean, just going back to the iPhone. So we spoke to business earlier last week. They basically created like a cloud platform for augmented reality, and the reason for that is that the next iPhone will have like a LiDAR in it. So pretty much as a consumer, you can create an augmented reality app. So it just goes back to what you're saying about these different applications that it's no longer an app on your phone, which is still amazing. It's now going way further. So there's a LiDAR on your phone, which then means that you could create your own augmented reality apps, which means that somebody in their bedroom could then create an educational tool, or they could create something that could then go to a big advertising agency. So the whole thing just being like more horizontally like spread. It's fascinating, and the exact same thing is happening in the space industry. I just wonder, so from like a PR and like a communications perspective, obviously when you went into Spire, like how did you feel like an outsider when you were going into I guess a new space company, or did the whole thing feel really natural right from the start?
Yeah, I would say it felt natural, because like there is the commonality of those things is that, new technology is new technology. You're going to have diverse thought. You're going to have a lot of smart people. You're going to have a lot of people with archival industry experience in an embryonic industry. Do you understand? Like when I came, like Jeroen from Spire has been designing satellites and, Joel Spark for 10 years, but the industry is only 5 years old. So it's like, there's the people outside the bounds of traditional business. If someone had 10 years experience at a company, it was like the sector would have existed for 20. But that's the unique thing. So no, I don't. I think the commonality is emerging technology. I think it's going to be the same kind of people. But the thing about new space is that what the end game of what you're actually doing is completely different. I think, with most creative destruction or emerging technology, it's going to be something that's redefining a traditional business process. It's making some sort of behavior completely ubiquitous, and it's buttressing processes that people already do to make something more streamlined. So that's one of those things that I look at in new space versus old space. I believe that in the new space sector, there's a lot more there aren't such drawn lines. There's a lot more capability to cross lanes, to learn about more data, learn about other parts of the launch process, the data process, the build process. Information is more shared when you're an emerging technology, because you're building something where you quite frankly don't know if it's going to work. So the amount of data where people, I remember like the very first websites that I launched with companies, it really was more about like, will the experience work? Does the technology work? Things like that. With space, there's a lot that can go wrong. It's very difficult. It's a long time from build to launch, or, with observation of data, how it comes back in the form of data that it comes back. I honestly believe that, we're at a time where all of these companies are showing the viability of it. And for me, when I came to Spire, or I do crisis comms or communications at any company, it's really about telling a story. And when the story they told me about the company when I came, it was amazing, and I was like, this is undiscovered country. People don't know all the stuff's happening in the space sector. People look at these companies the same way as they're looking at like an Iridium or, a traditional space company. You really shouldn't. Everyone in the sector said new space, but when I would talk to reporters, there are some people that were like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? Like in terms of framing it in a different way. But I mean, I was really lucky that one of the people that did one of the first stories I booked at Spire was Michael Sheets at CNBC. And I could look at Michael's path from when we first started doing stories. Like he was like, someone who covered the space sector, to now being the person at CNBC who's responsible for covering aerospace and space. They have a beat reporter on space. When I started at Spire, that was not the case. I think Forbes magazine is another good example. There's a couple people over there, Alex Knapp, Elizabeth Howell. Alex is probably one of the smartest people about science I've ever talked to in my life. It's very difficult for me to pitch him not having the same edification, but him and Elizabeth Howell are true champions of space. I think Elizabeth is also the editor of space.com, but they're people who were fanatics about space. So they're editorial and they're fanatical about science, and in their own rights have good career experience. They're giving you the same edification, teaching you what is new space, what are these delineations between the traditional sector, and how has new space evolved in this amazing, new revolution. And that's something that's completely unique to new space. I think there are reporters who have been fanatics about space before it was a commoditized business, that have now moved into the, realm of, I cover Blue Origin, I cover Spire, I cover Planet. And like, it was, great guys like Jeff Faust at Space News have been telling Spire story for almost, the life of the company. What challenge for me in communications when I came to Spire was telling the story that had been told in trade verticals like Space News, or any of the magazines that sort of guide the sector. I was really took the edict to Peter and to Nick Elaine, who was really largely the main reason I work at Spire. He sought me out because he felt they needed someone who had my skill set. Is I charged them with the edict that let's get those stories that you got in Space News and in the trade outlets, or and really pushed in the sector, in non-traditional outlets. So getting Forbes or getting Bloomberg, or getting traditional business outlets to cover new space. And that's one of the things I'm most proud of in my time at Spire, I'd say, is that we got outlets that never would cover someone in the new space sector to then become fanatical. But I think I did 2 stories at Forbes when I first came to Spire. And I think within the 2 years, we did almost 26 stories about, and that's a lot of stories. Like, I mean, I'm not only am I thankful to Forbes, I say that facetiously, in that that's a lot of stories. Every one of those stories was amazing, because it really, Spire was doing something amazing. Some of the partnerships we had with ISI, some of the capabilities that space data was able to enable, seeing dark vessels on the sea in ways that never had happened before. Spire Federal, like some of those things, like building those elements of the company through press and branding. It was, again, I was saying most things in business only happen once. I definitely look back at that as a time the whole world was falling in love with space. I was fortunate enough to, be at the helm of comms, or to me, it was probably one of the greatest space companies that's ever existed. I have a personal bias because I have a lot of Spire t-shirts, but the people that behind, the partners that I got to meet, like I always think of I talk about ISI a lot because I just love their technology, but the people, that was one of the first hits we did with was about our partnership with ISI and illuminating dark vessels with Elizabeth Hall at Forbes. And we did infographics that had never been created using AIS data and satellite data. And Forbes was so excited when they saw it. And, it harkened me back to being in the sixth grade, reading that book, Electronic Olympics. Like, I was like, they've never done this before. And, I seek that out. Like, really, I like undiscovered country. I like undiscovered technology. I like emerging technology, and I like brilliant people that are trying to prove a point with it. And, most people, when I, joined Shazam, people are like, that app is so over, no one uses it. And I was like, this app that is just got 1 billion downloads and it is ubiquitously used and makes grandmothers cool. And people didn't see, that part of it. I mean, we launched Beat Shazam with Jamie Foxx. That was probably it was the first television show that in North America that's based on an app. And I just remember that, it was the most expensive, game show set ever built. We got Jamie Foxx. It was one of those things that to see a licensing, an app of a television show that would be so successful from a licensing deal. That's what I saw when I joined the company. And I think that's something I've really been fortunate about, coming to companies where when I joined Spire, people were like, nano satellites, it doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? Like, it wasn't an easy sell. And I just mean my peers, not the media. And when I started to talk to reporters, I was like, this is a great story. Everyone understands it. And it's like, we did things like with Reuters, Katie Gregory came and did a segment about how, like, the rise of satellites in Scotland, like those things became pillar stories where, like, things that had only been discussed theoretically were now practically being discussed in the press. So things that were only being discussed theoretically were now practically being discussed in the press. And that to me, that's a PR practitioner's dream, that someone comes to you with a story, or, the whole idea of the space sector, the creative destruction, the fact that the door has been opened now, that you didn't necessarily have to come from the space industry. You could just be a good coder. You could just be someone that, has a really, really understanding of international legal rights, and be someone that is now involved with launches and the legal path work that each launch entails. And that's something that's kind of amazing, that I think if you were a lawyer in 20 years ago, you wouldn't be like, if I wanted to get a career path that had NASA in it, there would be steps and very detailed things you'd have to do. If you want to work at a new space company now, you can work at a new space company. I mean, I think 100%. You asked me, like, what's the difference now, is like the opportunity is actually there. Like, people are like, how do you get a job in space? First there has to be the job. There has to be that many viable companies that are looking for human capital. But then once that happens, it has to go beyond, do they have the seed money? Has it become a viable industry? After it's become a viable industry, has it become ubiquitous with people? I could tell you so many productions productions I've seen launched that people were like, everyone's going to watch video on Quibi. It's going to be the #1 thing in the world. And Quibi came and went short form videos as fast as the day is long, and nothing against the app. And I mean, it had amazing backers, Meg Whitman, Jeff Zucker, people that knew what they were doing. But you can't decide what a consumer is going to like. Something that's popular, something is ubiquitous. So right now, new space is very popular as a sector, as a consumer, as something that draws consumer attention, as something that draws human capital, as something that draws popular cultural interest. I think there was every time, it's interesting, I've noticed about new space is, like, they used to only cover the launches. Now crashes are covered. Like, and I know this sounds, I mean, it's nothing, it's not nothing anyone wants, but I noticed when there's a launch failure, it gets the same press as a successful launch. Yeah. And it used to be like, people, I mean, God forbid, no one wants that, but I just think it's a real more a barometer of the sector, that when you see businesses, if someone covers a particular sector or company at outlet, they're considered the beat reporter. Like, there's someone who covers Amazon at the New York Times. There's someone who covers, Facebook at Wall Street Journal. That's the beat reporter. And I was, I would say when I would pitch reporters when I came to the sector, I was like, there's really no space beat reporter. There's Michael Sheets now, but there's not really company. There's not a lot of outlets where like we have a space reporter. And that was 3 years ago. Now it's completely the opposite. Like every outlet has someone that's aerospace and new space. And, I even outlets that I didn't know who that guy was. It's the person who's like, oh, I was from Cape Canaveral. I always watched launch. And, you'll see them at the recent Blue Origin thing. There are 2 or 3 guys from CNN that talked about their history in Florida with launch. So I think the love of space is now amalgamating with new space. And that's like an amazing thing, because I always felt like when there was this delineation of old space and new space, it just always seems like this one's good and that one's bad. That's really not the case. It's just more like the evolution of a sector. You could say, old computer and laptop. Like it's kind of a thing. I mean, one of the funniest stories about me as a child, the first time my mother ever took me to a doctor, I was petrified because I'd never been to a doctor, and it was the first time I was getting a checkup, and I was just so completely nervous. And my mom was like, why are you so nervous? It's a doctor. You've been to the dentist. It's just, a checkup. I said, Mom, on the door, I read, it says he's a practicing physician. He's not a real doctor. He's practicing. And that, when the doctor came in, I go, I'm a little nervous because you're practicing. And I was a little kid, and the doctor thought it was the funniest thing in the whole world. He's like, son, we are all practicing at our career path.
Yeah.
Until the
That's
last
a very smart
day of
kid as
your life.
well.
Yeah. Until the last day of your life, the practice is over and you become a professional. That's what it is, all the accumulation. And I was like, wow. So the plumber's practicing and I was like, everyone should have practicing in front of their name. And I'll always love that doctor because it's a huge impression in my life that you're really defined. I think everyone's, really, by the grace of God, people are always telling me I have a crazy career path. Like my first boss was Oprah Winfrey. My second boss was John Hughes. Like that's not normal. And then you throw in Don Katz from Audible is a genius. Jeff Dodge is Craig. Like I really had a lot of really amazing, Neil Hunter, who the guy's largely responsible for why there's a commercial LED industry. He's a brilliant person. I've been very lucky. I think I said this earlier in the call or pre-call that people say most people stand on the shoulders of giants. I've just been very lucky in who those giants were. When I was like asking questions to my first boss about business and things like that, it was Oprah Winfrey. And that's not common. I could see it. I mean, it's just not, so many things that happened to me that were not common define how I am now. And, I said to the founders of Spire, I was like, you guys remind me of Oprah. And everyone laughed. They thought this was crazy. And I've said this about tech people many times because Oprah was the kind of person that really she ran that business. I remember we came one day to the studio, there was a power, the electric team came and said, the place was the size of 4 football fields, Harpo, her actual office. Someone came in and said, there's an outlet that's leaking electricity. And she's like, well, we have to find it. And the engineer was like, no, you'd have to go to every outlet in this entire facility. And there's hundreds of them. It would take weeks. We'll do it, but it's not something we can do in a day. I came back to work the next day. Oprah was in her makeup for the Women of Brewster plays, their dramatic character, walking around with like 9 guys going to every outlet in a giant facility, testing it to see which outlet was leaking. In between business calls where she went around to every outlet. And literally about 3 weeks later, they found it. And it was just her. And she had a tenacity and just like a hands-on way of being, where it's like there was no failure and she would not stop. And when you go to most startup founders, they have this blind passion of like, it's almost like when you really want to start a company and you have to do it, I think it's a mix between a blessing and a curse, because people only see like the IPO or like the merger, or the exit. I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of hard things in business and growing companies and how you do this, and I think the cool thing about everyone championing new space right now is that this is a time when a lot of people who took risks in the space sector 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 3 years ago, they're paying off, and not just in the dividends of, financial wherewithal or, SPACs or whatnot. I think people are really starting to understand there's intrinsic value in data that people could get from space. The fact that you could use a rocket once and use it again, and the price point and how that affects things, it really, really shows that this is the space industry's time for its close-up. And like most industries, when you get a close-up, it either fails or succeeds. And I think the space industry could not be more ready for its time to shine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, James, it sounds as though you've had some really kind of impressive mentors and read influential books. I guess what would be really good to kind of sign things off today would just be for us to get your kind of advice. So, I guess, what would be your advice for anyone looking to enter the space sector? What advice would you have for them?
Well, I definitely think when you're trying to get any job, you shouldn't just be looking for, this is the kind of job I want. This is the kind of career, I want. You should really be looking for a place. I always look for companies where like my particular skill set was incredibly applicable, but at the same time that it was applicable, I could bring something to the company where it would further what I know about technology, science, or business, and at the same time further their goals. Like it's really got to be symbiotic. You've got to find a place. Like a lot of people go for the boldface name, or I want to work at this company. I really try to find opportunities where it's like the company needs my individual skill set. So I'd say find companies and find opportunities that are succinct with your skill set, and also with the sweet spots of your brilliance. Like everybody has moments of everybody has something about them in their work capability that is completely unique. And I believe when you find a company that matches that uniqueness, it goes back to the thing that I just don't believe. You can't build a great company without great people, and I'll say it over and over again because, quite frankly, my mentors, those people have become friends and part of the pathway of my life because of how they ran their businesses like families. And I think that again goes back to the adage, like if you find some place where it's not just only an opportunity for you, but you're going to grow the vision, brand, and mission of the given company you join based on your attributes being added, it's a great thing. Because it's one thing to go somewhere and you're the guy they hired. It's another thing to go somewhere and you make a contribution, you add to the market cap and value of the company, and you also increase the company's value. That's what human capital is. It's like, the company is made up of all these individual people. So the brilliance of individuals make the brilliance of one company.
Yeah, that is really good advice. I think, for us, it's find something that you're passionate about, find something where you can add value and where you can feel fulfilled. And that's one thing we love about New Space. Whenever we work with a company and we transition people from outside the sector in, and we speak to them, it gets to a Friday night and, you're laying in bed and you have that sense of achievement. And
oh, yeah.
I think, that's something that you can't get in any sector, but New Space, like you say, because it's so new, you can really, really, really get that. So yeah, it's really good advice to find somewhere where you can add real value as a person, as an individual as well.
Yeah. And I also think that like when you look at, there's so many industries that are involved in the space sector, science, data, production, anything you can think of. And I would say, we talked about like the risk of like what can happen with launch, but when you look at companies that have had like 100 successful launches and all these things, there is like having a launch history and archival history in space. This is new to have that capability. You needed governments, you needed, a space agency, you need a lot of things that you don't need now. Now, don't get me wrong, we need all those things. I think the only way the industry will work is if private businesses and government embrace each other in a way that's never had before. I think like SpaceX and NASA is a perfect example of that. You're going to have to see us work together. But at the same time, I do think the opportunity is there. Like if you were someone who was a coder in 1965 and trying to bridge the gap to be like, I want to be sitting at a console at NASA in 5 years, I actually think that through it was much more difficult. Now the accessibility, the amount of conferences, the amount of people, the amount of internships, like seeing how someone could be an internship in New Space 1 year and the next year be working at a viable space company. Yeah. Couldn't tell you too many other sectors where someone was an intern 1 year and the theoretical experience they got them the practical experience that now they could say, I'm joining a launch team. And that's what, like you said, it's diverse, it's also open, and there's no ceiling. Yeah. I mean, the amount of time like doing PR specifically for the space sector, there's so many intricacies about launch, about data, about, safety, that it's not typical by any stretch of the imagination. So you asked me earlier, like, did I feel, I felt like a stranger in that I was like, I'm a PR practitioner coming into a new space company. But the beauty of it is I saw new space is probably the purest emerging technology play I've ever seen in my life, in that there are governments that have a use case for it, businesses that have a use case for it. You see companies like Facebook and Apple saying we need our own satellite constellation. Like, that's a thing. It's like 10 years ago, that wasn't something that was coming out of a boardroom or that you were hearing on a conference call, that someone's like, we're going to try to build something comparable to Starlink, like people building a satellite constellation. So by definition, you're going to have to need the people and the infrastructures and the frameworks that can build a satellite or that can build a constellation. Those are going to be parts of space as a service. I actually see that being something that, most companies will end up needing a white label program for space, but we're far down that road. But it does really bear well on everybody who's been in the sector for the last 10 years, because I just think you couldn't find more promising group of people, more promising group of technology with a practical application for business.
Amen.